a little bit. But does anybody have questions other than the issue with the YouTube link for the activity that is due on Friday night? For those of you who walked in after we talked about it, the video that we watched last class, the little short puppet looking Chipotle ad is what the link is trying to get you to go to, but for some reason that link isn't working. So you have the link on your modules tab on the PowerPoint that I have uploaded from this class. So don't worry about the fact that you can't get there with the link that it's providing on the activity. You've already seen it in class and you can go watch it again. Basically, the activities are a way for you to take what we're talking about in class, whether it's from the book or from lecture or discussion, and applying it to like a real world situation. And it's a little abstract because it's talking tangentially about some stuff that we've talked about in class, but not necessarily asking you outright like, okay, define heterogeneity, tell me what that is, tell me how it applies. It's more of, okay, here's a business decision that was made by Chipotle, how does it affect consumers, and you'll respond to the prompt. And this one deals specifically with ethicality, as you can see, with sustainability, but you can also bring in things like the benefit concept, so the way that they're treating animals, raising the animals, stuff like that. That's all stuff that we don't necessarily see on the back end or what we think about whenever we're consuming, but it might influence our choices. So bring in different topics like that, just so you can think about it in an abstract way, and I can see that you're approaching things critically and being able to apply it outside of just here's a definition, here's what I memorized word for word. I just want to see that you're being able to apply it and implement it. Do you have any other questions about that? Okay. So we're going to wrap up with chapter 3 today, and that'll be all the content that we have before our first test. Upcoming class is going to be the same. We've kind of resolved that issue with the link, so the sustainability activity is still going to be due at 11:59 p.m. on Friday, and then we will have a review day on Friday as well. That will be posted online. So what we do in class, I'm also going to put it online so that you can reference back to it whenever you're studying. And then the first portion will be in class September 9th and the 11th. We're going to have the online portion, and that's going to be at home, but we'll cover that in depth on Friday. Do you have any questions about what's coming up the next 2 weeks? Okay, just remember to stop me if you have questions. Okay, so last class we really focused on intangibility. And that was the first unique characteristic that we touched on between goods and services, and we're going to touch on the other 3 today. But what were some of the problems associated with intangibility for services and providers that we discussed? Yep, can't be inventoried. What was another one? Yeah, and you can't patent them. And then we had a couple more. So difficult to display and explain, and then the pricing. And we talked about each one of these in depth, and what were some of the solutions that we came up with to try and mitigate the negative effects coming from the problems. Okay, so how does word of mouth help? What examples did we talk about with that? What company specifically? We go online and we look at reviews on what website, typically? Yeah, Amazon more so, because word of mouth now is going to be much more powerful than information coming specifically from companies. So actually I'm auditing a class right now with the management department, and we read a book about Austrian theory of economics and how back in the 70s, which for the time it was relevant, but in the 70s it was more of advertising can either be used for persuasion or giving information to people that makes them aware of different market opportunities. So you can either become aware of a product you didn't know existed, or you can become aware of different benefits and uses of a product that you did already know existed but couldn't be utilized in that way. And the way that the book that we were discussing last night talks about it is this one-way interaction. So from businesses specifically to consumers, and they're sharing that information. But since then, it moved from businesses to consumers back to businesses as far as information sharing. So communication was reciprocal, and companies were learning in order to satisfy needs, what we have to do is learn what the customer wants. So that's when consumers got a little more power. And with the power, companies said, okay, if we can deliver what consumers are wanting a little more, then we can have more competition in the market and we can probably be more successful. But even since then, it's moved into this idea of the business to consumer triad, which is what we're in right now. And the consumer to consumer, adding that third element of the consumer interaction between one another, is what we're experiencing with stuff like the reviews with Amazon, which is what makes word of mouth so powerful. Okay, so today we're going to cover the other unique characteristics. Oh no, I didn't do this last time. I still think we can work with it. We talked a little bit about perishability, and what industry specifically did we kind of focus on as far as perishability? Kind of in leisure, so it was like the hotels, a little bit of transportation as well. So perishability, you have the problem of if we have a certain supply of, or if we have a certain amount of supply that we can offer, demand is going to be variable depending on what consumers want. So how do we combat for the issues that are presented? So one of the challenges is demand exceeds supply of service available. So can you think of a situation in which demand would exceed supply of a service? One's pretty close to home, like Mississippi State. Football weekends, right? All the hotels are booked in advance pretty much, and it's really, really hard to find a place to stay. So people are going to have to look outside of city limits, a little more like West Point, Columbus, and sometimes even further than that if it's a big SEC game. So it's another example of when demand could exceed supply of a service available. Ladies, how many of y'all have gone to get your nails done and the line is like, or not line, but I guess the waiting room, and whenever you walk in, someone's like, it's going to be 2 hours before we can get to you, right? Because so many people in that moment want to get their nails done. So there are lots of different little things that you can think of as far as services specifically. The second problem is going to be lower demand than optimal supply levels, right? So on a busy game day weekend here, demand exceeds supply, which we just talked about, but whenever there's not a big weekend, especially during the summer too, when nothing's really going on campus, which is really bringing a lot of people to Starkville in general, there's not much demand that's able to reach the supply level that's offered, right? So that's a problem for companies as well. So there's almost like this sweet spot of, okay, perfectly, what would happen is if our demand met our supply exactly, right, in equilibrium, but that doesn't ever really happen. So what are some solutions specifically towards the demand problem? What do you think? How can people and companies get creative to try and combat the issue of demand either being less than or more than the supply?
For the nail place, I think it make people book appointments.
Okay, yeah, so that's actually one of the examples that we're going to talk about. What else do y'all think?
I think airlines sometimes will upgrade your flight if you take a different time.
Okay, yeah, so if we're overbooked, and we'll give you a voucher if you move it so that somebody else can have it. That's a good example. So the first one that your book talks about specifically is utilize creative pricing strategies to shift demand. So we talked about this a little bit, like pay what you want. That's with intangibility sometimes as well. But what airlines will do, airlines are a really good example because they just implement a lot of the stuff that the book talks about, is a lot of times there's this sweet spot, right, of being able to purchase a flight. You don't want to do it too close to the time. You don't want to do it way too far out. So far out, it's pretty expensive. The closer it gets, it's a little less expensive. And then as soon as it's really, really close, it's expensive again. So the way that this dynamic pricing works is they're trying to cater to different types of classes that are going to be on the airplane. So a lot of times they're saying business class will purchase much closer to when the flight takes off. But since it's a business expense and a lot of companies will pay for their employees to do that, the company doesn't really mind spending more money because it's a part of the job that they have to do to send employees from X location to Y location. The second one is implement a reservation system. Wait, what did you say? What was your example? Was that it? Yeah, so basically have a reservation system. Making appointments, you can book it early. I know some places here, nail salon's just always a good example. You can call sometimes and request people that day, so they'll just have you at certain times. Even if you're going to give blood, you can call like the Mississippi Blood Services, I know, and they will let you sign up for a time that you're going to actually come in. So it's this idea of, all right, we know the demand that we're going to have for the day because people have already signed up. So how can we adjust for maybe some supply that we still want to have filled, or if we know it's going to be busy based off of the reservations we've already gotten, how can we kind of roll the punches? Another one for demand is shift demand to complementary services. So a good example, a video that we're going to watch today, relates to Kayak. Who's familiar with Kayak, the company? It's like a third-party travel agent, basically. So what they do is offer all kinds of different travel options, whether you want to buy like excursions, airline tickets, rooms, whatever it is. So what they can do is if there's high demand in certain areas, they can try and shift that to complementary areas, right? So if you're going to fly somewhere, unless you're going to see family, it's a logical thought to say, oh, okay, if they're flying somewhere, then maybe they need a place to stay. How can we incorporate that in our wheelhouse and be able to glean those benefits from consumers if we already know that's going to be their next action that they're going to be taking? The last one is utilize non-peak demand period to prepare for peak period of demand. So that just means in a time when it's not as busy, what can we do as a company or a firm to make sure that we're enhancing our experience during the really, really busy times, right? So in the downtime, what can we do, again, to implement something better and offer a better service delivery as a whole? So what do y'all think some solutions for supply are? Looking at the challenges again, we have too much demand, we can't cater to everybody, we don't have enough demand. How do we figure it out on the supply side?
I mean, I guess for like restaurants or like bars, you could do like a theme night.
Okay, yeah, that's a good example. That's pretty closely related to one of the ones that we're going to talk about. Another one too is use part-time employees to increase supply of service. So if you just need more hands on deck, just bringing in people to do certain tasks that might not necessarily require a crazy amount of knowledge or this level of expertise that most people won't be able to achieve. It's just having people there to do all kinds of different actions so that the people who carry out the service specifically can cater to more individuals. So just think of restaurants, right? You're going to have more waiters and waitresses probably during and before like football game season on Saturdays and Sundays and Fridays leading up to it. Share capacity with other providers. This just means basically like let's use the resources that we have in a way that we can spread them out. So your book is the example of there are different medical companies and medical services that will share the expense of storing some of the machinery that they use. And they'll both be able to use it, but they don't have to necessarily pay for two different types of machines because it's super expensive, so they can just utilize that together in a way that works well for them. And then prepare for expansion in advance. This kind of relates here, just on the supply side of it. So making sure that you're doing that ahead of time to have plenty of time to, again, optimize that service whenever it comes time. And then the last one is increase customer participation. So what is customer participation? How do consumers participate in services?
Maybe like at Aldi's, instead of having customer service employees, they have you bag your own stuff.
Yeah, that's a really, really good example. What your book caters to really is think of going to a restaurant, right? So a lot of times now, if you go to certain establishments, they'll give you your cup and you have to go fill it up with whatever drink you want. And then another example is like you have the salad bar and you go and make your own salad rather than making it in the back. And those are just really, really small examples, but it's more of this giving, not the burden necessarily, but the task to the consumer, and now the consumer is participating in the service as a whole. Okay, so heterogeneity is our next one. And heterogeneity, the challenges, we've already talked about this a little bit because it was dealing with ethicality and why heterogeneity allows consumers to be a little more vulnerable to unethical actions by service providers. The challenge is that service standardization and quality control are difficult to achieve. So there are two solutions to this, kind of big picture, but knowing, okay, we can't really standardize a service because of that human element, which deals with inseparability, and that's going to be the next unique difference that we're going to talk about, or unique characteristic. How would you try and mitigate the negative effects of the fact that we can't really standardize or control the quality of something? In our example with Starbucks, remember we talked about how Starbucks, if you go to one location, the exact same drink could taste totally different because they did it a little differently. The baristas weren't trained exactly the same. So how would you combat that issue? Okay, that's a good example. So the first one is pursue a customization strategy. So leaning into the fact a little bit that it's not going to be the exact same every time, which is kind of like what you were talking about. A customization strategy can look different in a variety of ways, and the examples I'm going to talk about are a little more small scale. But think about Netflix. Netflix offers, based off of your viewing history, here's what we think you would like, right? So it's taking into account what you, the customer, have already shown to like, and even the little, who pays attention to when it says it's a certain percentage of a match? If you don't know, if you would like the movie, you never really heard of it, but you see this percent of a match based off of what you've watched in the past, it's basically customizing your Netflix experience. And while it's not necessarily a massive service that we think about a lot, it's customizing whatever preferences you have for your viewing experience as a whole. And then another example, of course, is going to be Alexa. How many of y'all order stuff from Amazon just asking Alexa to refill an order? Nobody does. Does anybody have Alexa in here? Oh, okay, so only one person. Have you ever bought stuff on Amazon to where it's like you bought this cereal and it should be running out now? You want to repurchase it? Who knew Alexa did that? Okay, so just a few hands. So what Alexa does based off of your purchase history with Amazon, since it's all connected, Alexa will say, hey, you bought this, like for moms, it would be like you bought diapers 2 weeks ago, and based off of the quantity that you purchased, an average use would mean that you would be finished with that round of diapers in like a week and a half. Do you want to go ahead and refill your order? You can just say yes or no. And all you would have to do is say yes, and Alexa would go ahead and fill that because all of your information is auto-populated through Alexa. So that's customizing based off of the preferences and the purchase patterns you've shown in the past, making it much easier and offering that service now. Another solution is total opposite end of the spectrum, which is going to be pursuing a standardization strategy. So how could you pursue a standardization strategy knowing that there is this heterogeneity aspect to services? There are a couple ways that your book talks about. Okay. So your book talks about, one, you can either replace human labor, and it would have to be something more skill-based than knowledge-based, with a machine, right? So the machine is obviously going to be a lot more quality control, standardized. It's going to be the same over time. So what does that mean? The other option is really focusing on trying to build a team across the nation that would be trained in a very, very similar way. So sometimes that doesn't work necessarily, like we've seen with Starbucks. All of their training is very, very similar. We already talked about Chick-fil-A in the past, and Chick-fil-A has this consistent reputation of being great customer service, and that's because they spend so much time adequately preparing their team members to make sure that they fit this mold and to make sure that they can keep Chick-fil-A on brand, right? If you've had Dr. Brazil's branding course, he talks about being on brand. And for Chick-fil-A, we talked about what that means as a service early on in the semester. And because they do such a good job of training, they're able to keep that reputation among all of the customers. And then, of course, again, the example of the machine. But the machine would have to be something, again, really small that they could just implement. I mean, I guess you could say there are drink stations that if you wanted a certain alcoholic beverage, you could put it in, and it would be a robot barista that makes it, and it has everything measured to a T. Have y'all seen that before?
Yeah, there's actually like a Keurig for alcohol.
Okay, so something along, I don't know how that works, actually, I haven't seen that, but it like ratios of stuff, what to put in.
Like you'll take like vodka, tequila, rum, whiskey, and put them all in containers, and then put water in it, and you choose what drink you want.
Okay, and it knows how to do the ratio and everything. So that's kind of a small example where typically we would associate that with the barista, right? But now you have different machinery that can do that. So just this idea of if Starbucks ever wanted to have 100% consistency, it would need to be machine implemented, but that would kind of be away from the service experience that they're offering, right? So for them, it's obviously a good idea to forego, but for others, it might not be as big of a deal and it can be implemented. Okay, so the last one that we're going to talk about is inseparability. Inseparability just means that the service provider cannot be separated from the service that is delivered, which is actually the first challenge. But that's basically the whole essence of inseparability. Like, okay, the provider has to be physically connected to the service, right? You don't really have, like, think of when you get a good, you don't really think about like the people who are manufacturing it, XYZ, all of that went into the good, right? But what goes into the service is happening simultaneously with the presence of the service provider. So what challenges could that present?
Like a hairdresser can only have so many appointments.
Okay, so that kind of goes hand in hand a little bit with the perishability and the demand and supply, but yeah, that's a problem, right? So it's finite in time, which we talked about a little bit last class, and since it's finite, that doesn't mean, again, with the perishability, that you can do it in the future, right? It has to happen in the now. Customers are involved in the production process. So that would mean us. One of them is other customers, but we'll talk about that in a second. So when it says customers are involved in the production process, there are different levels that were involved. Think of it kind of as a spectrum. You have low levels of involvement, which would be like us going to a concert or going to a symphony. All we have to do is be physically present to experience the service, right? We don't really have to do anything else other than be there and enjoy it. But on the opposite end of the spectrum would be something like education, where you're having to put in a lot of work. Like, you're having to be here present, yes, but you're also having to pay attention. On your own accord, you're having to read the book, you're having to do the activities. You get in or you get out as much as you put in, right? So it's this idea of low level, simply being present, high level, being present and super active in it, and trying to put in as much as you can so that you can get all the rewards and the benefits that you're trying to get from the service in general. We've talked a little bit about this in the first couple chapters. So other customers are involved in the production process. Do y'all remember some of the examples of why we said having other customers present could be a negative or a positive thing?
Like in a movie theater, somebody's talking too much or on their phone.
Absolutely. So we talked about how, I think it's called the Alamo Drafthouse in Texas, how they cater specifically to people who don't want to be interrupted at all during a movie. And their policy is if you're talking or if you're on your phone, you're automatically kicked out. And that makes some, did anybody go watch that video that I posted about it? No. They just talk about how frustrated some of their customers are, but those are the customers who get kicked out, right, who aren't abiding by those rules. The last one is mass production is difficult. So again, kind of like what you talked about, if you're going to get your nails done, if you're going to get your hair done, then you cannot mass produce that service, right? It's finite in time. Typically, it's one service provider to one or a couple of consumers, and it's not much more than that. So you can't really mass produce a service like you can mass produce a good. And mass production, again, would have that machinery component because it would be easier to cater to different things. So looking at all those challenges, what are some of the solutions that you think service providers could try and come up with? We talked about some of them with heterogeneity, and then some of them are kind of similar to like the Alamo Drafthouse. So first solution, which corresponds to the physical presence, can't be separated at all, would be strategic selection and training of public contact personnel. So again, think about the Chick-fil-A example that we talked about and how, again, Starbucks baristas are trained to know exactly what to put in certain drinks. Sometimes it comes up short, but for the most part, their idea is a standardization approach, and it's going to 8 times out of 10 be pretty consistent. The next solution is effectively managing consumers. So what do you think that means, effectively managing consumers? Kind of goes hand in hand with this next one, the use of multi-site locations. So what I want you to do with these specific boxes right here is think all 4 of these kind of working together. So effectively managing consumers, we talked about how there are certain rules to abide by. So we talked about, I think, a luxury dinner. Like if you were going to go out to eat at a really, really nice restaurant, the way that you could effectively manage a consumer would be to put that requirement in place of, you have to have a nice jacket and certain types of shoes that cover your toes. There are some places who do that, where it's like, here are rules up front before you even come into our establishment so that you know the level of service that we're providing and that you can meet our expectations so that we can then deliver the expectations to you in a way that either leaves you satisfied or delighted. And the use of multi-site locations would be the idea of expansion. So again, last 2 slides ago, we talked about how in non-peak times, you want to be able to be prepared for peak times. That kind of goes into this idea of, okay, maybe we can use multiple different locations to cater to more consumers. What does that look like? Especially if there are certain types of customers who prefer, I don't know, maybe like a more fun service experience and ones that prefer a more relaxing service experience. There's actually this article done by some marketing scholars who have looked at different types of happiness, and they're saying happiness in the present moment has to do a lot more with being calm, where happiness in a futuristic sense has to do a lot more with excitement. And I don't know if it's bringing in anticipation, but in our seminar, our professor was saying, okay, think about happiness and think about a time when you were happy in the moment. It deals more with being calm. It's not mutually exclusive, but it's mostly being happy in the moment means calm versus futuristic means excitement. So some consumers are more wanting an exciting experience versus a calm experience. Maybe you could have different locations for that. Or even just think of like going to a Broadway show, you have balcony seating. So it's not a separate location, but you have your own private box that you can view if you don't want to really be near all the other customers. So it's this idea of kind of partitioning or even offering like separate sites as a whole to try and mitigate the fact that other customers could have a negative effect on consumers. And again, it's going to boil down to preference. So offering different sites can cater to those different preferences. Okay, so what's going to happen now is the video that I wanted to show last class that we didn't get to. We'll watch that. And this really doesn't talk specifically about any one thing in general that we've covered so far, but I think it does a really good job. The founder of Kayak does an interview, and what he's talking about is looking at different employees, and he's talking a little bit about Kayak, and I want you to really pay attention because I think it talks a lot, undertones at least, about what we've talked about so far. I think it's a good recap of the material that we've focused on in a way that you can see in a business setting. So it kind of makes you think of different ways you could approach your activity, and it's also just kind of a recap of what we've talked about in the business setting before we transition to the tests on all the topics. So while you're watching, he's not going to actually say the words explicitly, like I said, so it's not going to be talking about this idea of heterogeneity or talking about this idea of ethics, but it's going to be talking about the way they conduct business as usual, and I want you to try and draw connections to what we've talked about in class. I've already written a few down based off of what I've seen, but I want you to do the same. We can talk about it after we watch it.
What about hiring? How many people do you guys have?
So we have about 150 right now.
And a significant portion of product engineering.
Yeah, most is in the engineering team. Outside of Boston, about 90 people right now.
How do you think about that sort of hiring of those people? Maybe like from the initial hires, I assume it's a different process then to as you scale.
Yeah, we think about hiring. One is I would say that we don't hire for open positions, but we hire for people we were looking for athletes. We're looking for star performers, and then we find some great. We make a spot for them. I would say that I'm always recruiting, so I'm in New York today. I'm meeting someone right after this interview that I'm considering bringing on board, someone that I met at a conference I spoke at last week at MIT. And so one is just always recruiting. And then as we look for the bringing a team, to me, it's less important how many years experience they have or whether they know about travel or not. In fact, one of my unwritten rules at Kayak had been I wouldn't hire anyone to the engineering team that had ever worked in travel before, because I wanted engineers that would do stupid things, that would just say, not knowing that other travel companies tried X, Y, and Z, we would just try things that seemed obvious to us. But it's just find people that have been successful at something, and then just a big believer in that success translates. And if someone is great in a totally different consumer business, I think their success there will work in travel if you find people who are their star performers at that other company.
So let's talk a little bit about ITA, which is this company that Google bought. I think it was, $750 million or something.
Yeah.
And I think when they bought it, a lot of people in tech were like, what's ITA?
Right.
And then I think there was some regulatory scrutiny, which eventually I think it was approved with conditions or something. So Google now owns ITA, which is a company that you'll explain much better, but it somehow powers a lot of sites like, or I should say, is a component to powering some sites like Kayak. Is that correct?
Yeah, ITA, we use ITA to get airline information, mostly in the U.S. They're not so great internationally. But
And
Yeah,
ITA itself
well-
was a Boston startup, correct?
Yeah,
So
it
it's
started
like-
with Jeremy Wertheimer out of MIT. Great guy, great company. And they work really closely with airlines, particularly in the US. And they're one of the data providers to us. We also, the major airlines, we all talk to directly. We have web services interfaces to them. And then we also have GDS connections, such as Amadeus, who's a really strong player, especially internationally. It also gives us availability across agency and across the suppliers. In addition to that, we also talk directly to the OTAs, so to Expedia, Travelocity, Orbitz, and Priceline. And yeah, so for in the US, for airlines, ITA had more a few years ago than today, but still one of our important data providers.
And as part of that deal, your contract continues, or?
Yeah, our contract continues, and we actually have a good relationship with the ITA team, and we do have access to the technology in the future.
But what I didn't understand about that is, so Google claims they weren't going to have an unfair advantage. Why else would they buy them? Except to have an unfair advantage. I mean, like,
Good
I
question.
mean, they would just be
License it.
license it. Yes.
That's a good question.
Okay. I mean, I think they buy it so that at some point they're going to favor themselves and
Right.
whatever, be faster
Right.
or better or whatever,
I mean, I
or
think-
eventually cut off the contracts once of other people once.
Yeah, I think a
the
lot of
government's
it-
not looking over their shoulder.
A lot of the angst in the industry at the time the deal was approved, as you said, with conditions, was really people just becoming concerned about Google getting their fingers in too many things and having access to too much of your information. I was at South by Southwest last week in Austin, and there was a FBI agent who actually gave a presentation about how much he knows about people and how much information he can get. And as scary as it was when he presented that FBI could glean from public data about you, I think Google actually knows more.
You know?
And I think that, people always look when Google enters a new industry and they buy access to data. It just makes some people nervous about, are they going to get exclusive access or
They
access?
released their product, correct? I think I tried it, and it seemed pretty nice. But I haven't heard of people.
Their flight search product.
People
It's
using
a
it. But
decent product. It certainly hasn't impacted us in traffic standpoint. And I think this January, for example, I think our traffic was up 40% over last year. So we're growing very quickly. I don't think Google's release of a product has had any impact on us.
Let's talk about mobile. So so obviously with feature phones, you probably couldn't do much travel search. Smartphones have changed that.
Right.
How important does that become to you, and how are the challenges different?
It's important for a number of reasons. One, it's a big portion of our traffic right now. It's almost 20% of our traffic is coming on mobile. The other thing, it's been a really good design reference for us. I think when we built the first version of Kayak for mobile, which was for an iPhone, I was wondering really how much Kayak could we put into an iPhone, because Kayak had been known for being a power tool. There's just every possible option you need is on Kayak. And I was thinking, God, we're going to really have to bastardize it and come up with a very minimal version of Kayak that would actually work on an iPhone. And to my surprise and delight, the team that we hired to build our iPhone product actually found a way to build a version of Kayak that has all the same power of Kayak, but is expressed in a way that was actually more simple than our website. So it's been a great product. I think we're 5-star rated in the App Store. We're the #1 product for a travel
iPad
company.
ones are nice too, you say.
iPad product has gotten really good reviews. It's a great product. We take a lot of advantage of the size of the screen and kind of the tactile input. But it really has impacted our website as well. I think the design experience there we have learned in the iPhone, which is to force simplicity because you have less real estate, has caused us to rethink how we do design on the web. And it really has been kind of a nice complementary product set, how mobile and web works together on Kayak today.
What about the actual transaction, right? Because unless you have someone logged in and their credit card information saved, it's kind of a nightmare on mobile to try to like type in your credit card, right? I mean, like I've heard this from other mobile developers. So like, what's your thoughts there?
I mean, in general, if I look at as a user of Kayak, and I travel a lot, so I use Kayak a lot. The thing that I hated the most about Kayak last year as a user was I grew certainly as one of the founders of Kayak. I have a lot of opinion and influence on how the product evolves. But as I was using Kayak, I would find the hotel I wanted, and then when I went to buy the hotel, I had to leave Kayak and go to the hotel website. And a lot of times, you want to find interesting hotels. And it's one of the cool things about Kayak is we have a larger set of inventory than an agency who only sells hotels in route. But as bad as
what
it
are the
is,
odds that I have account to this random hotel, right?
Yeah, and yeah, especially because we can surface the really interesting hotels you might not know. Then you have to suddenly go to their website, and it's a little bit, oh man, I have to learn how to use their website to have an account. As bad as it is in the web, it was a disaster on mobile. And even today, most of the airlines in the US don't actually have iPhone apps, or if they do, they don't let you book. It's a really miserable experience. So using Kayak, a year ago, you would find the flight you want, the hotel you want on your iPhone or your Android phone, and then we went to book it. You were brought to this supposedly mobile website, which is awful and didn't work well on the phone. So about 9 months ago, we released a booking capability on our mobile products for iPhone and Android that the very first time you do have to enter your credit card, but beyond then, we then let you look at, like for hotels, any hotel you want, and whether you have an account there or not, the fact that you've stored your credit card once just makes it
So
one
you store it with the
easier.
app, and then the app will autofill the fields.
The app will do all that heavy lifting behind the scenes. Yeah.
That's interesting. And so, what, just like in summary of your last, whatever, 10 years or something, what are some of the, I guess, most interesting lessons you've learned that you might share with, like, maybe aspiring entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I guess the first thing I would say to a young entrepreneur or new entrepreneur is, as hard as you think you work in recruiting, work much harder. If I look at the mistakes that I made at Kayak over the last 8 years now, I would say it was being not aggressive enough in certain people that I now work at Kayak that I wish I got them sooner. And when you find someone who's a total star, one person can completely change your company. And so as a founder, the first thing I would say is just work like crazy to try to identify who are the really talented people that can change your company. And network, keep asking the question, keep going at it, and try to find extraordinary people. And then the second thing is...
And then, by the way, this is like, there's no substitute for just hard work there, right?
No.
Like people, I get asked the question, like, is there a great website? Is it not? It just, just a
It's
million things. You got to go to a million conferences.
Yeah.
Whatever. You got to, like, go to schools. You got to go to, right? I mean...
Yeah, it's a lot of hard work. And the other thing is, if as an entrepreneur, you yourself are not a recruiter, you should just be honest about that and say it's not, if you're a techie and you really just like designing a product and you're not natively a recruiter or a connector, just find a co-founder who is. But one of the 2 or 3 co-founders needs to be a recruiter as part of their job. And one of them needs to be someone who just really loves finding talented people. That's the first advice I would give. The second thing is just be really close to your customer. And a lot of times as designers, we have ideas that end up being terrible. And the only way to find that out is by letting a customer use our product quickly so we can see if it works or not.
And then you also do some angel investing.
Yeah, I do a little of angel investing, and I also consult for venture capital firms, mostly the firms that are investors in Kayak. So General Catalyst, Sequoia, Excel, and Oak, and I have looked at companies for those guys.
And as an investor, what is your, like, do you have sort of a general philosophy of what you look for?
Yeah, I think to me it boils down to, I would say, 3 things. The first one is, again, the team. And I would say that's 70% of my decision. And what I look for in a set of founders are they aggressive? Do they have a track record of getting things done? Are they ethical? Are they fun? Are they people I want to hang out with for 5 years? Can they recruit? Are they hungry? Do they have the fire? To me, that's 70% of the decision. And when I find founders who meet that, I want to write them checks because I just trust that they'll figure it out and build the right team. 20% for me is, what market are you chasing? Is it a big market? Is there change going on? I like change because it gives an opportunity for a new guy to do something different than what the established players are doing.
This goes back to sort of the history of Kayak, which is there was a clear sort of inflection point.
Yeah, there's a huge inflection point where the airlines and the hotels were pissed off at how much power the agency had over them, and they really wanted to find a way to service customers directly. And then
This is also like it's something called the why now question or something, right? Like,
Yeah.
If it didn't happen, you have to assume there were smart entrepreneurs came before you.
right.
If it didn't happen before, there needs to be some, like, sort of external change that's enabling it to happen now.
Yeah, and that for Kayak, that was precisely the tension between the suppliers and the OTAs. And then the third thing I'll look for, so let's say it's 70% team, 20% is in a huge market and is it undergoing change, which gives you opportunity. And then for me, and maybe this is a little bit of an exaggeration, 10% is, oh yeah, tell me what you're doing. And the reason I say that's only 10% is I want to tell entrepreneurs that do not fall in love with your idea too much, because it's usually the case the original idea is not the idea that ends up making you wildly successful. The thing that will make you wildly successful is having an unbelievably strong team. So you want, we look at how our product compares to our competitors. I also look at how my team compares to my competitors. And I always set it up with the kayak team, kind of man for man, or person for person against any team in travel. And to me, that's the first thing of identification I'm going to build a good company, because I have a team that'll beat other people. And if you have that team, you're going after a big market that's changing, your widget that you first think is the right thing to invent, the new service you're doing, or the new product you're building, you can rapidly evolve that to fit the market as it's changing.
Interesting. And so, last question. You filed for an IPO.
Yeah.
What do you see as the sort of the future, to the extent you can talk about it, I guess, of Kayak?
Yep. So we're in active registration, which I can't really talk about IPO. I will say that we continue to update, so you can read our quarterlies to see how we're doing financially. And right now we're really focused on improving the product. We win a lot of awards, best product in travel, but we're never satisfied. And I know that every time I use the product, I always look at ideas of things I can do better. And so we're pretty aggressive to try to figure out how to make the product simpler, how to make it faster, and that's where we spend most of our time right now.
And is it for you? Is it just kind of growing market share in travel search, or do you think eventually you'll be, in other areas of search?
Yeah, it's funny. Each of the engineers at Kayak has a design of Kayak for different verticals. So inside Kayak, we have designs for Kayak for dating, Kayak for used cars, Kayak for cooking. I mean, it's crazy how much you can apply our type of UI paradigm on mobile or on the web. But realistically, travel is a huge, huge market. It's 8% of US GDP. It's about 40% of all e-commerce from a dollar standpoint. So we have a lot of headroom in travel. And the other thing about travel is, if you look at other travel websites, it's painful. Travel is supposed to be fun. And even business travel is supposed to be stress-free. And a lot of things are just the planning part and the booking part is awful, and the customer service. And so I think we are seen as the innovators within the space. And I just think there's a lot more opportunity to make things simpler. And that's what we're focused on doing.
Great. Thanks so much for being here.
Okay, 2 reasons I wanted us to be able to watch this video and discuss it is, first and foremost, this is kind of like a trial run of what you could bring in a really abstract situation that's presented to you to apply the material that we've talked about. So we'll discuss that in just a second and see what parallels y'all could bring into what was talked about in the video and what we discussed in class. But also, I've given this spiel to my other classes. I think it's really important to remember that while we are in a classroom setting and we're learning things by chapter and by unit, we categorize those in our brains to where it's separate from one another, but it all really blends together and builds off of each other. And you have to be able to utilize all these different aspects that we're learning about separately in the classroom simultaneously in the market space. So who drew some parallels of what was talked about and what we talked about in class? How can you relate it to what we talked about in class? I have a bunch of stuff, but I want to hear what you all said first.
I think like the invisible organization and system. So you talked about a lot of behind the scenes, like
Yeah.
what they do, like
Yeah.
they do the heavy lifting or whatever.
Yeah, so what I had written down, I think basically what you're getting at is the benefit concept, so stuff that we aren't even realizing. Like they talked about ITA a lot, and they talked about how ITA is really what provides that data. So we don't even think about how the data is provided. We're just benefiting from that in general. And then their mobile devices that they were trying to transition into, making that much less cumbersome. Again, so much goes into that on the back end that we don't even think of. Thankfully, we're just, again, gleaning those benefits. Okay, what were some others that y'all?
I talked about how they were making the iOS app, trying to make it really strong, and I think that's sort of solving the heterogeneity problem of different experiences with different services.
Yeah, that's a really good example. So trying to standardize it a little bit, but also have this customization element maybe on past purchases. That's really good. What else did y'all notice that was related to what we've discussed so far? So we talked about recruiting a lot. He said as a co-founder, I think you have to have at least one co-founder that can recruit really, really well. And this is kind of an abstract level, but remember when we're talking about what differentiates competitors in the service market? Well, services in general are defined as skilled competences, or I guess competences in general. And you can break competences down into skills and knowledge. And we talked about how knowledge is really the area. If an employee has that, that's what you can build off of to have a competitive advantage over your competitors. So really trying to find Kayak in their idea, if you even heard about what they're doing, is they have different engineers thinking of complementary products, which we'll touch on again here in a second. And they mentioned like dating, kayak cooking, stuff like that. And all of those engineers have this different expertise or these ideas that they can bring to the table to try and differentiate or expand kayak even more. But they were also talking about those complementary services, which we talked about with the supply and demand. And that wouldn't necessarily be with travel specifically, but getting into this area of, okay, what are complementary services that we could offer that's still under our brand image? And we talked about how having a strong organizational image in general is another way to combat some of the challenges that services face. Does anybody have any other parallels they could make?
I don't know if this would make sense, but like inseparability or whatever, like the customer is involved because they're choosing what hotel they want.
Yeah. So customer involvement's a really, really good one. So he mentioned something about like we want to be really, really close to our customers. Do you remember him saying that? So that's almost this idea of customer participation. So he said if we roll something out, and I think his example was the mobile channel. If we roll our mobile channel out, we want our consumers to use it as soon as possible so we can learn how they like it, how they don't like it, and they're participating in this idea of customer co-production or co-creation, where they provide feedback to the service provider, and the service provider then uses all of that information, kind of like a focus group, but not necessarily in a room like this where a focus group can be conducted, but just getting that information from consumers and then fixing whatever it is that the consumers didn't like to then offer them a better service in general. So it's a really, really good example of like bringing in that customer participation, because really the only way you can know if you're satisfying your customers' needs, which y'all showed that y'all knew and carried away from Melissa Moore's class, is for them to tell you directly what they like and what they didn't like. So you can know where to allocate your resources more heavily and where to pull away from. Some, especially if it's in an area that's not offering a benefit that the company thought would be a benefit. So of course they're a third-party provider. I didn't talk about this, but your book does talk about how looking to third-party providers is another solution to challenges, especially in regards to the supply and the demand. And they kind of touched on that a little bit, where they were saying there was this point where more so airlines were frustrated with the way that they were having to do business, but these third parties could come in and act as an intermediary between the customer and like the airline provider or the hotel and make it a little less cumbersome for them. One more thing too that I kind of wrote down is they kept talking about their relationship with ITA, which was the company that provides them with all of their data. So and we briefly mentioned this, so I didn't expect anybody to be able to make this connection, but we talked about service dominant logic and what components were there, and one of those components were relationship marketing. So Kayak kept talking about the relationships that they have with their not service providers, but with their data providers, and how important that was moving forward, especially since Google had just purchased ITA. What is that relationship going to look like now that it's under new management? But the fact that the strong relationship is there in general allows them to be more effective as a company. And because the relationship is strong, there's less likely to be uncertainty or high risk associated with it, and there's more trust and commitment, which is crucial in being able to conduct business in a way that allows you to be more successful in general. So I hope us kind of talking about different ways you can apply information to what was talked about, even if the words aren't used specifically, will help you realize maybe how you can approach the Chipotle activity, because it's a little more abstract, kind of like what this video is. But again, I think it's really important to know we're not just learning information here to memorize it and do well on a test and then go figure it out later in the world. Like if we can go ahead and apply it to different things going on in the world, then that'll help us be in a place where we're in the real world. We're like, okay, how do I simultaneously put all the things I have in my brain to work and actually put them into action? Do y'all have any questions before we head out today? Okay, if y'all have any questions, remember y'all can just text my Google number or y'all can send me an email, especially as you kind of start looking at the assignment and activity. I encourage you not to open it at 11:50 on Friday night because chances are I will not respond between that time. So just go ahead and give yourself plenty of time to get that done and ask questions if you need to. Y'all have a great day.